There are some people in this universe who look at a perfectly good rule and think, well, that's adorable. But what if we tried it backwards while standing on our heads? Cassandra had always been one of those people, which, coincidentally, was exactly how she'd discovered that Rigelian moss actually thrived when you insulted it daily. The crew of the research vessel Meridian's Edge had grown accustomed to her unique approaches to xenobiology. What they hadn't grown accustomed to was the sound currently echoing through the ship's corridors. Mayday! Mayday! This is transport vessel Cathara's Light. We are going down. Repeat, we are. The transmission cut to static, then silence. Captain James looked up from his morning coffee with the expression of a man who'd just watched his vacation plans burst into flames. Well, he said, setting down his mug with deliberate calm, that's not ominous at all. Signals coming from Cathara Prime, called out Navigator Hollis from the bridge. Uninhabited system, sir. Nothing but rocks and attitude problems. Of course it is, James muttered. Because when did distress calls ever come from pleasant resort planets with complimentary spa services? Set course for the source, and somebody wake up Augustus before he misses another chance to tell us how we're doing everything wrong. Dr. Augustus emerged from his quarters 20 minutes later, looking like he'd been personally offended by the concept of sleep itself. His perfectly styled hair remained somehow immaculate, despite having just rolled out of bed, which was either impressive or deeply suspicious. I certainly hope, he announced to no one in particular, that we're not about to waste valuable research time on some merchant vessel that forgot to check their fuel gauges. Your compassion is truly inspiring, Cassandra remarked from where she was reviewing the sensor data. I'm sure the potentially dying people will appreciate your concern for academic scheduling. Augustus sniffed. Some of us understand the importance of maintaining research priorities, Cassandra. Not everyone can afford to treat xenobiology like a hobby. Right. Because my 3 published papers on symbiotic neural networks were clearly just weekend crafts projects, she shot back, not looking up from her screen. Dr. Penelope chose that moment to enter the bridge, probably saving Augustus from whatever cutting response was forming behind Cassandra's innocent smile. Are we arguing about academic credentials again? She asked cheerfully. Because I have a whole medical degree that says I don't care what any of you think about anything. Planetary approach in 15 minutes, Hollis announced, wisely steering the conversation away from interpersonal warfare. What they found on Cathara Prime was, well, calling it a crash site would be like calling a supernova a minor lighting issue. The alien vessel had apparently decided that landing was a purely optional concept and, instead, chose to become intimately acquainted with the planet's surface at roughly the speed of bad decisions. Life signs? James asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. 3 small ones, Hollis reported, frowning at his displays. Moving, but barely. Everything else is. He gestured helplessly at the twisted wreckage spread across a quarter-mile of unfortunate landscape. The away team consisted of James, Cassandra, Penelope, and Augustus, because apparently the universe had a sense of humor about forcing people to work together during catastrophes. They suited up and descended to the planet's surface, where the air smelled like ozone and regret. Well, Cassandra observed, surveying the destruction, somebody's definitely not getting their security deposit back. The vessel had been beautiful once, sleek lines and graceful curves that spoke of a civilization that valued artistry alongside function. Now it looked like modern art created by a very angry tornado. But it was the sounds coming from within the wreckage that made them all freeze. Soft, plaintive calls, almost like crying. "That way," Penelope said, medical instincts overriding caution as she moved toward the source of the sounds. What they found in a partially collapsed section of the ship made even Augustus pause his usual stream of observations. Three small creatures huddled together in what had once been an elegant cabin, now opened to the alien sky. They were unlike anything in the databases, roughly the size of Earth bear cubs, but with 6 legs and fur that seemed to shimmer with an internal light, like living crystal. Their large, dark eyes held an intelligence that was unmistakably sentient. "Oh," Penelope breathed, immediately dropping to her knees, despite the jagged debris. "Oh, you poor little things." The cubs, for lack of a better term, pressed closer together at the sound of her voice, their crystalline fur shifting from pale blue to deep purple. Around them lay the bodies of 2 larger aliens, clearly the same species, whose injuries were extensive. "Parents," James said quietly. "They died protecting them." Augustus was already scanning the cubs with his equipment. "Fascinating. This species isn't in any of our records. The bioluminescent fur appears to be some form of natural fiber optic system, possibly for communication or—" "Augustus," Cassandra interrupted, "maybe save the scientific enthusiasm until after we make sure they don't die too?" One of the cubs made a sound that was heartbreakingly close to a whimper. Penelope reached out slowly, speaking in the soft, soothing tones she usually reserved for frightened patients. "It's okay, little ones. We're here to help." The cubs didn't flee when she approached, which was either a good sign or meant they were too weak to run. When she gently touched the nearest one, its fur brightened slightly, shifting toward a warmer golden hue. "They're dehydrated," she reported, "and probably haven't eaten in days. We need to get them to the ship immediately." Getting 3 traumatized alien cubs aboard the Meridian's edge without causing them additional panic turned out to be about as straightforward as explaining quantum physics to a particularly stubborn rock. They eventually managed it by having Penelope continue her stream of gentle reassurance, while Cassandra and James created a makeshift carrier from salvaged ship materials. The cubs huddled together during transport, their fur cycling through various shades of blue and purple that seemed to correspond to their emotional state, which, Cassandra noted, was apparently terrified with a side of existential dread. Back aboard the ship, they set up a temporary habitat in one of the unused labs. Penelope immediately began checking them over with every medical scanner she could find, while Augustus hovered nearby, making what he probably thought were helpful observations. "Initial scans show them to be in generally good health despite their ordeal," Penelope reported. "No major injuries, just exhaustion and dehydration. But they're definitely malnourished." "Right," James said. "So what do we feed them?" It seemed like such a simple question. It really did. Penelope tried water first, plain, filtered, the good stuff. The cubs sniffed at it politely, then turned away like she'd offered them liquid disappointment. Standard nutrient paste met with even less enthusiasm, if that were possible. Synthesized proteins, vitamin supplements, even small amounts of various plant materials from their botanical samples. Nothing. "Maybe they're carnivores?" Augustus suggested, producing a small sample of replicated meat protein. The cubs looked at it with the same expression most people reserved for tax audits. "Okay," Cassandra said, after 2 hours of increasingly creative attempts at alien fine dining. "They're definitely not impressed with our culinary skills." The cubs had retreated to the far corner of their temporary enclosure, pressed together in a small, shimmering pile. Their fur had settled into a dull gray that somehow managed to look both sad and accusatory at the same time. This is concerning, Penelope admitted, running another medical scan. They're getting weaker. Whatever they eat, they need it soon. Have we considered, Augustus said with the tone of someone about to share profound wisdom, that they might require specific atmospheric conditions for feeding? Or perhaps their food needs to be prepared in a particular way? Have we considered, Cassandra replied sweetly, that maybe they're just not that into us? But even as she said it, she was studying the cubs with the kind of focused attention that usually preceded either a breakthrough or a spectacular explosion. Something about their behavior was bothering her. Not the refusing food part, that was obviously the main problem, but the way they seemed to react differently to each crew member who approached. With Penelope, their fur had brightened slightly. With James, it shifted toward warmer tones. But with Augustus, it stayed resolutely gray, occasionally dipping into what could only be described as aggressively unimpressed purple. "Darwin," she called to the ship's AI, "run a bioanalysis on our guests. I want to know everything: metabolic rate, neural activity, energy expenditure, the works." "Processing," Darwin's synthesized voice replied. "Scans indicate highly unusual neural patterns. Brain activity is significantly elevated despite physical exhaustion. Additionally, their fur displays measurable electromagnetic fluctuations that appear to correlate with proximity to crew members." Electromagnetic fluctuations? Augustus perked up, momentarily forgetting to be condescending. Fascinating. They might be naturally telepathic, or perhaps, Cassandra interrupted, a slow smile spreading across her face. "They're not hungry for what we think they're hungry for." She approached the enclosure slowly, crouching down to the cub's eye level. "What if," she said, more to herself than to the others, "food isn't what you need at all?" The cubs watched her with those large, dark eyes, and for just a moment their fur flickered from gray to a pale, hopeful silver. Outside the lab, the Meridian's edge continued its course through the stars, carrying its unusual cargo toward an uncertain destination. In the depths of space, 3 small aliens were about to teach humanity something new about survival, connection, and what it truly means to feed another living being. What they needed, Cassandra was beginning to suspect, wasn't something you could replicate in a synthesizer or find in any database. What they needed was something uniquely, impossibly human. She just had to figure out what that was before it was too late. Sleep, as it turned out, was a luxury none of them could afford. The cubs had spent the night huddled together in their makeshift habitat, occasionally making soft sounds that managed to be both heartbreaking and accusatory at the same time. By morning, their crystalline fur had faded to an alarming shade of pale gray that reminded everyone uncomfortably of old dishwater. "Well," James announced, staring at the medical readouts with the enthusiasm of a man reading his own obituary, "this is going splendidly." Penelope had been monitoring them all night, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by the grim determination of someone fighting a losing battle. "Their metabolic rate is dropping," she reported, highlighting sections of data that might as well have been written in ancient hieroglyphs for all the good news they contained. "At this rate, we have maybe 18 hours before—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Augustus, meanwhile, had spent the morning consulting every database in the ship's memory banks, cross-referencing alien dietary habits with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never met a problem that couldn't be solved with enough academic research. "Perhaps," he announced with the confidence of someone who'd clearly cracked the code, "they require live prey. Many carnivorous species refuse processed proteins." Live prey. Cassandra repeated slowly. On a research vessel, in the middle of space. Well, obviously, we'd need to synthesize something appropriate. Augustus, James interrupted with the patience of a saint who was rapidly approaching retirement. We tried replicated meat products yesterday. They looked at it like we'd offered them homework. But Augustus was nothing if not persistent. He'd spent the better part of 2 hours attempting to force-feed the cubs various combinations of nutrients, proteins, and synthesized compounds. The results had been educational, in the way that watching someone try to convince a brick wall to tap dance might be educational. The cubs, for their part, had endured his ministrations with the stoic patience of creatures who'd clearly given up on the intelligence of their rescuers. Their fur had remained resolutely gray throughout the entire process, occasionally flashing to what could only be described as deeply unimpressed purple, when Augustus got particularly enthusiastic about his theories. Maybe they're just stressed, Penelope suggested, though her tone suggested she didn't believe it any more than the rest of them did. New environment, traumatic experience, strange beings poking at them with medical equipment. They should still show some interest in food, Augustus countered, apparently immune to the concept that his approach might be fundamentally flawed. Even stressed animals will attempt to eat when faced with starvation. Cassandra, who'd been watching this exchange with growing irritation, finally spoke up. Unless they're not actually starving for food. The lab fell silent except for the soft humming of life support systems and the occasional plaintive sound from their alien guests. "What do you mean?" James asked, though something in his expression suggested he was afraid of the answer. "I mean," Cassandra said, approaching the enclosure with deliberate slowness, "what if we're operating under a completely wrong assumption? What if food, as we understand it, isn't what they need?" Augustus scoffed. "That's ridiculous. All biological entities require some form of nutritional intake to survive. It's basic biology." "Is it?" Cassandra knelt beside the enclosure, studying the cubs with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for particularly stubborn equations. "Darwin, show me those neural activity scans again." The ship's AI obligingly projected a holographic display of the cubs' brain patterns. Even to untrained eyes, the activity was clearly abnormal, far too elevated for creatures in their physical condition. "Look at this," Cassandra continued, pointing to specific sections of the display. "Their neural activity spikes whenever one of us gets close. And their fur changes color based on who's approaching. That's not just communication, that's active response to external stimuli at a level that should be impossible given their current energy reserves." "So?" Augustus demanded, though he was studying the display with obvious interest, despite himself. "So, where is that energy coming from?" Cassandra asked. "They're not eating, they're barely drinking, and yet their brains are running at maximum capacity. Either they're the most efficient biological machines in the universe, or they're drawing energy from somewhere else," Penelope finished, understanding dawning in her voice. "Precisely." Cassandra stood, pacing the small lab with growing excitement. "What if they don't consume matter for energy? What if they consume something else entirely?" "Like what?" James asked, though his captain's instincts were clearly telling him he wasn't going to like the answer. "Like emotional energy, psychic impressions, the electromagnetic patterns generated by conscious thought." Cassandra was talking faster now, ideas cascading over each other like water over rocks. "Think about it. Their fur responds to our proximity. Their neural activity changes based on who's nearby. What if they're empathic feeders?" Augustus looked like she'd just suggested the cubs survived on rainbow dust and good intentions. "That's That's completely unscientific. Energy cannot be consumed in such a manner. It's thermodynamically impossible. Is it? Cassandra challenged. We've encountered species that photosynthesize using gamma radiation, others that metabolize gravitational fluctuations. Why is emotional energy any more impossible than those? Because emotions aren't energy, Augustus sputtered. They're neurochemical processes, patterns of brain activity, which generate measurable electromagnetic fields, Darwin interjected helpfully. Human neural activity produces approximately 20 watts of electrical power under normal circumstances. During periods of intense emotion, this can increase significantly. Augustus opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, apparently stymied by his own AI taking the opposing side. Okay, James said slowly. Let's say you're right. How do we test this theory? Cassandra looked at the cubs, who were watching the discussion with those large, dark eyes. Their fur had shifted slightly during the conversation, no longer the flat gray of despair, but not quite hopeful either. We try feeding them feelings, she said simply. The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for moments when someone suggests something either brilliant or completely insane, and no one's quite sure which. That's, Penelope began, then stopped. Actually, that's not entirely crazy. Some Earth species respond to human emotional states. Dogs can sense fear, horses react to nervousness. What if these cubs need that connection to survive? But how would you even attempt such a thing? Augustus demanded, clearly torn between scientific curiosity and professional skepticism. Cassandra was already moving toward the enclosure. Same way you feed anything, I suppose. You offer it up and see what happens. She settled herself on the floor next to the cub's habitat, close enough that they could see her clearly, but not so close as to be threatening. The three small aliens watched her with obvious curiosity, their fur shifting from gray toward a tentative silver. Okay, she said softly, more to herself than to the others. Let's see if you're hungry for something a little different. She closed her eyes and let her mind wander to a memory. Not just any memory, but one filled with warmth and joy and the kind of emotional resonance that seemed appropriate for feeding starving children. A summer day from her childhood, lying in tall grass and watching clouds drift across an endless blue sky, feeling perfectly safe and loved and content. For a moment, nothing happened. Then one of the cubs made a soft sound, not quite a purr, not quite a sigh, and when Cassandra opened her eyes, she found all three of them pressed against the side of their enclosure closest to her. Their fur had brightened noticeably, shifting toward pale gold with flickers of warm amber. Well, James said quietly, I'll be damned. But the effort had taken more out of Cassandra than she'd expected. She felt oddly drained, as if she'd just run a marathon or given blood. The memory itself seemed fainter somehow, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. Cassandra! Penelope was beside her in an instant, medical scanner in hand. Your neural activity just spiked and then dropped significantly. Are you all right? I'm tired, Cassandra admitted, accepting Penelope's help to stand. More tired than I should be from just sitting there. Augustus, meanwhile, was staring at the cubs with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been gently but thoroughly demolished. This is unprecedented. They actually drew energy from your emotional state. But the metabolic cost to you was significant, Darwin confirmed. Cassandra's brain activity dropped by 15% following the interaction. The energy transfer appears to be quite literal. So we can feed them, James said slowly, but it costs us. The question is, how much are we willing to give? The cubs were still pressed against their enclosure, looking brighter and more alert than they had since being brought aboard. But they were also looking at the rest of the crew with unmistakable hope, as if they finally understood what was being offered. "We'll take shifts," Penelope said decisively. "Small amounts from each of us, so no one person bears the entire cost." "This is highly irregular," Augustus protested, though his heart clearly wasn't in it anymore. "We don't know the long-term effects of such energy transfer. It could be dangerous." "Everything's dangerous," Cassandra replied, settling back down beside the enclosure despite her exhaustion. "The question is whether it's more dangerous than letting them die." Outside the lab, the Meridian's Edge continued its journey through the stars, now carrying not just 3 alien cubs, but the beginnings of an unprecedented first-contact situation. Because if these creatures truly fed on emotional energy, on the memories and feelings and experiences that made up conscious life, then humanity had just stumbled across something that would change everything they thought they knew about survival, connection, and what it truly meant to sustain another living being. And in the depths of space, 3 small aliens were about to teach their rescuers that sometimes the most important things we can share aren't the ones we can hold in our hands. What followed could generously be called organized chaos, or less generously called watching a bunch of adults try to figure out how to emotionally feed alien children without accidentally traumatizing anyone involved. Which, as it turned out, was significantly more complicated than it sounded. "Think happy thoughts," Penelope instructed, settling herself beside the enclosure with the determined expression of someone about to perform surgery on a particularly difficult patient. "Birthdays, holidays, that sort of thing." "That's very scientific," Augustus muttered, though he was hovering nearby with his scanners like an anxious parent at a school play. "Just think happy thoughts." Truly, we've reached the pinnacle of xenobiological research. "Would you prefer we let them starve while you write a proper research proposal?" Cassandra asked, from where she was monitoring the cubs' responses. They'd brightened considerably since her first feeding attempt, their fur now cycling through gentle shades of gold and amber instead of the depressing gray that had become their default setting. Penelope closed her eyes and focused, her face taking on the serene expression of someone accessing pleasant memories. Almost immediately, the cubs pressed closer to her side of the enclosure, their crystalline fur beginning to shimmer with warm, peachy tones. "Working," Cassandra reported, watching the cubs' vitals on her display. "Their energy levels are definitely improving. Whatever Penelope's thinking about, they like it." "My wedding day," Penelope murmured, her voice soft with remembered joy. "Dancing with my husband under those little string lights we hung everywhere. He stepped on my dress twice and apologized so sweetly." The cubs made soft, contented sounds, their fur now glowing with warm, golden light. But just like with Cassandra, the process was clearly taking its toll on Penelope. Within minutes, she was looking pale and drained. "That's enough," James said firmly, helping her to her feet. "Darwin, monitor everyone's vital signs during these feeding sessions. I want to know the moment anyone's pushing themselves too hard." "Acknowledged, Captain," the AI responded. "I should note that both Cassandra and Penelope have experienced notable decreases in neurochemical levels associated with positive emotions. The transfer appears to be quite literal." "You mean they're actually taking our happiness?" James asked, sounding like someone who'd just discovered his insurance premiums had doubled. "In simplified terms, yes," Darwin confirmed. though the effects appear to be temporary, similar to emotional exhaustion after significant stress. Augustus, meanwhile, had been studying the readings with growing fascination. "This is remarkable," he admitted reluctantly. "They're not just drawing energy from emotional states. They're actually metabolizing the neurochemical patterns associated with specific memories and experiences." "In other words," Cassandra said, slumping against the wall as exhaustion caught up with her, "they eat feelings, literally." "Which raises an interesting question," James said, eyeing the cubs who were now looking significantly more alert and healthy. "What happens when we run out of happy memories?" It was not, as philosophical questions went, particularly comforting. But they pressed on, taking turns feeding the cubs in carefully monitored sessions. Each crew member brought their own memories to the process. James shared recollections of his daughter's first steps. Augustus reluctantly offered memory of receiving his first academic award, and even some of the other crew members volunteered their time and emotional energy. The cubs thrived under this unusual diet, growing stronger and more active with each feeding. But something else was happening too, something none of them had expected. "Are you seeing this?" Cassandra asked, pointing to a shimmering distortion in the air above the cubs' enclosure. What she was seeing defied easy description. The air itself seemed to be flickering, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, but with colors and shapes that almost resembled— "Is that a hologram?" Penelope asked, leaning closer. It was more than a hologram. As they watched, the distortion resolved into a perfect three-dimensional projection of Penelope's wedding day, complete with the string lights she'd described, the flowing dress, and a younger version of herself dancing with her husband under a canopy of stars. "Oh," Penelope breathed, tears springing to her eyes. "Oh, that's exactly how it was." "They're projecting the memories," Augustus said, his voice filled with scientific wonder that managed to overcome even his usual condescension. "They're not just consuming the emotional energy. They're storing and reproducing the actual experiences." The projection shifted, showing Cassandra's childhood memory of lying in the grass, watching clouds drift across an endless summer sky. The detail was perfect, down to the feeling of warm earth beneath her back and the sound of wind rustling through tall grass. "This is impossible," James said, though he was staring at the projections with obvious fascination. "They're creating perfect visual representations of memories they absorbed from our minds." "Not just visual," Darwin observed. "I'm detecting acoustic, olfactory, and even tactile elements in these projections. They appear to be complete sensory reconstructions." More memories began to appear. James's daughter taking her first wobbly steps, Augustus accepting an award at some prestigious ceremony, fragments of joy and pride and love floating in the air like living dreams. "They're like living archives," Cassandra said, understanding beginning to dawn in her voice. "They don't just feed on emotional energy, they preserve it, store it, maybe even share it." "But why?" Penelope asked. "What's the evolutionary advantage of being able to reproduce other beings' memories?" That question was answered when the projections shifted once more, showing them images they'd never seen before. Alien landscapes of breathtaking beauty, crystalline cities that spiraled toward purple skies, beings who looked like the cubs, but larger, more mature, living in complex social structures that seemed to revolve around the sharing and preservation of experiences. That's their home world, James realized. They're showing us where they come from. The images continued, telling a story without words. The cubs' parents, for they were clearly visible now, fleeing their beautiful world in terror, carrying their children toward an uncertain fate among the stars. The crash that had killed them, leaving 3 small survivors alone on an alien world. But there was more. The projections showed glimpses of a vast civilization, one where beings like the cubs served as living libraries, preserving the memories and experiences of their people across generations. They were cultural historians, living repositories of everything their species had learned and felt and accomplished. "They're not just random alien children," Cassandra said, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "There's something much more important." "Memory keepers," Augustus breathed, his scientific mind racing ahead to the implications. "They're the living archives of their civilization. No wonder they feed on emotional energy. They're designed to preserve and protect the experiences of others." The cubs seemed to understand that their message had been received. The projections faded, leaving them looking at their rescuers with those large, dark eyes that now held a different kind of intelligence, not just animal cunning, but the weight of cultural responsibility. "Well," James said after a long moment, "this complicates things." "Does it?" Penelope asked. "They're still children who need our help. Children who happen to be the living memory banks of an entire civilization," James pointed out. That's a significant responsibility." Cassandra was still staring at the space where the projections had been, her mind racing with possibilities. "The sharing goes both ways," she said suddenly. "They can project memories they've absorbed, which means they can share experiences between different species. They're not just archives, they're bridges." "Bridges to what?" Augustus asked, though his tone suggested he was afraid of the answer. "To understanding," Cassandra replied. "Real, genuine understanding between species. They could share our experiences with their people, and their experiences with us. It's first contact on a level we never imagined possible." The implications were staggering. Not just communication between species, but actual sharing of experiences, emotions, memories. The kind of connection that could bridge any gap between civilizations. But first, they had to keep 3 small aliens alive long enough to make it home. "The question is," James said quietly, "are we strong enough to sustain them until we can get them back to their people? This memory feeding, it's taking a real toll on all of us." It was true. Despite the wonder of what they'd discovered, the crew was showing signs of emotional exhaustion. The constant sharing of positive memories and experiences was draining them in ways that conventional nutrition never could. "We'll manage," Cassandra said firmly, settling back down beside the enclosure despite her obvious fatigue. "We have to. They're not just alien children anymore. They're the future of interspecies relations." The cubs pressed against the wall of their enclosure, their fur glowing with gratitude and something that might have been hope. In their dark eyes was the reflection of memories not yet shared, experiences not yet preserved, and the promise of a connection between species that could change everything. Outside the ship, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the small drama playing out aboard the Meridian's edge. But inside, 3 alien children were teaching humanity that sometimes the most precious things we can share are the ones that live only in our hearts and minds, and that true sustenance comes not from what we consume, but from what we're willing to give of ourselves to others. Sometimes the universe has a sense of timing that borders on the theatrical. Just when everyone aboard the Meridian's edge was getting comfortable with the idea of emotionally feeding alien memory keepers, the cubs decided to share something that made their previous revelations look like casual small talk. The projection started without warning, filling the lab with images so vivid and detailed they might as well have been standing on the surface of an alien world. But these weren't the peaceful, crystalline cities they'd seen before. These were scenes of war. "Oh," Penelope whispered, unconsciously reaching out toward the holographic display. "Oh no." The Cubs' homeworld burned in shades of crimson and gold, their beautiful spired cities crumbling under weapons that turned matter itself into cascading light. Two factions of their people, identical in appearance but clearly divided by ideology, tore their civilization apart with the methodical efficiency of beings who'd forgotten what they were fighting for. "Civil war," James said grimly, recognizing the patterns even across species lines. "They're destroying themselves." But the projections continued, showing something even more devastating than physical destruction. The memory keepers, adult versions of their cubs, were being systematically targeted by both sides. Libraries of living experience were being eliminated, millennia of cultural memory dying with each fallen keeper. "They're not just fighting for territory or resources," Cassandra realized, her voice tight with horror. "They're fighting over history itself, over which version of their cultural memory gets to survive." The images shifted to show the Cubs' parents, clearly important figures in their society, making the desperate decision to flee with their children. Not just to save their lives, but to preserve something far more precious: the uncorrupted cultural memories of their entire civilization. "They were running to save the archives," Augustus breathed, his usual condescension replaced by genuine awe. "These Cubs, they're not just random survivors. They're the backup copies of their entire species' accumulated knowledge and experience." The projection faded, leaving the lab in comparative silence, broken only by the soft humming of life support systems and the Cubs' gentle breathing. The three small aliens looked at their human rescuers with eyes that now carried the weight of their true purpose. "Well," James said after a long moment, that's quite a responsibility." "It's more than that," Cassandra said, her mind racing through the implications. "If their civilization is destroying itself, these three might be the only intact memory keepers left. They're not just important, they're irreplaceable," which was exactly when Augustus decided to remind everyone why he was generally considered the least popular person at academic conferences. "This presents an unprecedented research opportunity," he announced, his eyes gleaming with the kind of scientific enthusiasm that usually preceded ethical disasters. "Think of what we could learn. The memories of an entire civilization, preserved in living form. We could study their technology, their culture, their entire evolutionary history." "Augustus," Penelope said, in the tone usually reserved for explaining why setting things on fire was generally discouraged. "They're children. Traumatized children who've lost their parents and their entire world. Children who happen to contain the most valuable scientific data in the known galaxy," Augustus countered. "Surely we have an obligation to preserve that knowledge for the benefit of all species." "We have an obligation," James said firmly, "to get them home safely. That's what their parents died trying to do." "Home to what?" Augustus demanded. "A civilization tearing itself apart? They'd be safer here, where we can protect them and study." "Where we can study them like lab specimens, you mean?" Cassandra interrupted, her voice carrying the kind of edge that suggested Augustus was about to have a very bad day. The Cubs seemed to sense the tension in the room. Their fur, which had been glowing with warm golden tones, began shifting toward the deep purples and blues that indicated distress. They pressed closer together, making soft sounds that managed to be both heartbreaking and accusatory. "Look what you're doing to them," Penelope said, moving to comfort the cubs. They understand more than we think. They know when they're being discussed like objects instead of people. But the cubs had something else to share. Another projection began forming in the air above their enclosure, this one showing something none of them had expected. It was Earth, not as seen from space, but as experienced through human memories, fragments of life and love and loss that the cubs had absorbed during their feeding sessions. Cities and forests, families and friends, the entire tapestry of human existence viewed through the lens of emotion and memory. They're archiving us, Cassandra realized. Every memory we've shared with them, they're preserving it as part of their collection. The projection shifted, showing glimpses of what could only be described as a vast library of experiences, not just from their own species, but from dozens of others. The cubs weren't just memory keepers for their own people. They were collectors of consciousness itself, preserving the experiences of every sentient species they encountered. This is what they are, James said quietly. Living bridges between civilizations, not just preserving their own culture, but connecting all cultures through shared experience. Which is exactly why they're so valuable, Augustus insisted, though his tone had lost some of its earlier fervor. Imagine what they could teach us about other species, other ways of thinking and living. Imagine, Cassandra countered, what we could teach them about things like consent and free will, and not treating sentient beings like walking databases. The cubs' projection shifted once more, showing them something that made everyone in the room go very still. It was a glimpse of their future, not a prophecy, but a possibility drawn from the memories and hopes they'd absorbed. It showed the cubs grown to adulthood, serving as bridges between their recovering civilization and humanity, facilitating the kind of understanding between species that had never before been possible. But it also showed them making that choice freely, as beings with their own agency and desires, not as preserved specimens in someone's laboratory. They know, Penelope said softly. They know what we're arguing about, and they're telling us what they want. What they want is to go home, James said firmly. Darwin, set course for the cubs' homeworld. We're taking them back where they belong. Captain, Augustus protested, you can't seriously be considering. I'm not considering anything, James interrupted. I'm making a command decision. These cubs aren't research subjects or cultural artifacts. They're refugees, and our job is to get them safely home. Even if home is a war zone, Augustus demanded. Especially if home is a war zone, Cassandra said, settling beside the enclosure where the cubs were watching the discussion with obvious interest. Because maybe that's exactly what their people need. Memory keepers who've learned something about hope and cooperation from a species crazy enough to risk their own emotional well-being to save 3 alien children. The cubs pressed against the wall of their enclosure, their fur brightening to warm gold as they sensed the decision that had been made. They began projecting one final image. Not a memory this time, but something that felt like gratitude made manifest. It showed all of them, the entire crew of the Meridian's Edge, as they appeared through the cubs' perception. Not as captors or researchers, but as family. As the beings who'd chosen to feed them with pieces of their own hearts when conventional sustenance had failed. Course laid in for the cubs' homeworld, Darwin announced. Estimated arrival in 18 days. 18 days to prepare 3 alien children for whatever we're going to find when we get there, James said, and to prepare ourselves for the possibility that we're about to become the first human ambassadors to an alien civilization. No pressure or anything, Penelope murmured. though she was smiling as she watched the cubs settle into what looked like the first genuinely restful sleep they'd had since being brought aboard. Outside the ship, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the small drama playing out aboard the Meridian's edge. But inside, 3 alien children slept peacefully, their crystalline fur glowing softly with dreams made of human memories and hope for a future where understanding between species wasn't just possible, but inevitable. The journey to the cubs' homeworld passed in a strange rhythm of routine and wonder. Each day brought new feeding sessions, new memories shared and preserved, and new projections that revealed the depth of what they were carrying. The cubs had begun showing them glimpses of their civilization's golden age, cities that sang with crystalline harmonics, art forms that existed in dimensions humans couldn't quite comprehend, scientific achievements that made their own technology look like stone tools. But they also shared the gradual decline, the ideological splits that had torn their people apart, the moment when preservation of memory became more important than creation of new experiences. It was a cautionary tale written in living light, projected with the innocence of children who didn't yet understand the weight of their inheritance. "They're teaching us," Cassandra observed, during one particularly vivid projection, showing their people's early attempts at interstellar travel. "Not just preserving our memories, but actively educating us about their civilization." "Preparing us," James corrected, "for what we'll find when we arrive." And what they found when the Meridian's edge finally dropped out of hyperspace in the Cubs' home system was both better and worse than anyone had imagined. The war was over. The beautiful crystalline cities still stood, though many bore the scars of conflict. But the silence that greeted their arrival was deafening. Not the silence of death, but of a civilization holding its breath, waiting for something that might never come. When the Cubs projected their final message, a beacon of hope made manifest in the form of human memories mixed with their own cultural knowledge, the response was immediate. Ships rose from the planet's surface, not in aggression, but in welcome, their hulls flickering with the same crystalline patterns that adorned the Cubs' fur. "First contact," James murmured, watching the alien fleet approach. But not the way anyone expected it to happen. The Cubs pressed against their enclosure, their fur blazing with colors that had no human names, projecting images of reunion and homecoming and the promise of a future built on shared understanding rather than fear. And in the depths of space, 3 small aliens were about to teach 2 civilizations that sometimes the most important bridges aren't built with metal and stone, but with memories, hope, and the willingness to feed each other with pieces of our own hearts.